Okay, so in this video we'll be going over some of the exporting options in Crocotile 3D and also showing some examples in other programs on how to import what you've exported. So right here we have a scene open and I have two objects in it. I have this raft object and this crate object over here, right there. Okay, so you can also see them listed in the scene tab. We have the raft object and crate object here. Now you could right click each item in the scene and you could export each object individually if you want to. You could export it to an OBJ file and it gives you some options here, and I'll go over these later. And then you just export it and then choose the name right here and then save it. Okay, so you could also, if you want, you could export it to a prefab object and just write a name in it and then save. And what that does is it allows you to import the object, the prefab object, into other scenes. So you would just click this button here if you want to import a prefab object. For example, I could choose this one and open that one, and it gets added to the scene here. And then I could just click this and then go into draw mode, and here's my prefab object. Or I could just right click and add to scene, and it'll add it wherever the crosshair, 3D crosshair, is located. Okay, so that's one way of importing objects that you've created in Crocotile 3D into other scenes that you're making. Okay, so right now I'm just going to delete that. And when you import a prefab object, it will also import all the tile sets that it uses. Okay, so in that case it created a duplicate of a tile set. So I'm going to choose that one and then I'm going to remove it. And I also have these other tile sets that I'm not using, so I'm going to remove those. Now when we go into file and then export scene, we could also export the objects, but we're going to choose export scene for now. It'll give you a list of all the objects in the scene, and you could include these objects when you're exporting. All you have to do is basically click this and it selects all of them, or you could select which ones you want to include individually if you want to leave some out, for example. Or you could also choose a layer to select whatever's inside the layer. Okay, so for now I'm just going to select all of them. Over here we have more export options that you could use when exporting. We have a merge vertices option, and what this does is it basically merges any overlapping vertices. So let me close this out for a second and show you vertices that are overlapping. So if we look over here, for example, we have a tile and another tile here. Now this tile has a vertex right here that's not overlapping any other vertices, and it also has one right here. But over here it shares a vertex or is overlapping another vertex of another tile. So if you have the merge vertices option enabled, it will combine these vertices into just one vertex. Okay, and then the polygon from this tile right here, this triangle, its vertex will be shared with the polygon of this other tile, basically. And that's basically to lower the amount of vertices that the exported object will have. Okay, so maybe that helps with the data size and other things and that sort of stuff. It might help with small gaps and things like that, because if there's like a very tiny gap, it might combine the vertices together. Okay, So the next option here is a Vertex Normals option, and you can choose between flat and smooth. If it's flat, then let me show you right here. We have two tiles, and it forms an edge between them right here, okay? And it also has an edge within itself between the two triangles, okay? And depending on how bent these polygons are with other triangles, it'll create an edge, okay? An angle, okay, between the tiles, okay? And for example, right here, you can see it bent right here. It's a slight bend, and maybe this one has a slightly more bent edge to it, to the polygons. For example, over here on the house, we have an angle, like a 90-degree angle, okay, right here between these two tiles, okay? And if you export with flat vertex normals, the vertex normals will use the face normal of the tile or the polygon that those vertices belong to, okay? So this tile is facing this direction, and this tile over here is facing this other direction, okay? And the vertices will keep basically that direction. Whereas if you select the smooth vertex normals, it will attempt to kind of average the vertex normals with neighboring polygons, neighboring tiles, okay? So this edge between these two would kind of get blended together, and the vertex normals works with lighting and rendering and that sort of stuff. And so you would see like the shadow blended between these two tiles if you have it smoothed, okay? If you have these vertex normals averaged together. If it's just flat, then you'd have a very hard shadow, a hard edge to these polygons. And I'll show, like, I'll illustrate it once we export some objects and import them into other programs. We'll be able to see the difference between a flat vertex normal and the smooth one, okay? Now if we go back into the exporting options, we could see that when we have a smooth vertex normals chosen, we could specify the angle threshold. So anything below this angle would get smoothed together. So I have it set to 89, and so those angles that I showed you just before that form a 90-degree angle, those won't get smoothed together. But anything else that is less than 90 degrees, such as this tile and this tile, they form an angle next to each other that is less than 90 degrees. Their angles are more similar to each other, so they'd be smoothed. The vertex normals would get averaged together, okay? And I'll show you examples of this later. And you can change this angle to whatever you want. But if you choose 90 degrees, there's a little bug with it, so I choose 89 instead. So I still have to fix that anyways. But the next export option that you could choose is to export all the textures into an MTL file, or export all the textures as well as an MTL file, okay? That's if you're using multiple textures, multiple tile sets, okay? And if your objects are using multiple tiles that use multiple tile sets and that sort of thing. If you don't have this selected, if you don't have that enabled, then it'll just export the current tile set. Okay, so any objects that are using the current tile set, that's all it will export. Okay. So then you'd have to go to each tile set and export each one, and you'll get multiple objects that use just one tile set if you don't have this enabled. Okay, and then you'd piece it together in another program when you import it, or you can just select this to enable the MTL file. It'll export everything together, and then you just have to export the object in the MTL file, or you just have to import the object, the MTL file, and the program should piece it all together by itself. Okay. So when you do that, you can specify the name of the textures, and then it adds a little underscore and then a number for each tile set, each texture that you're exporting. And then there's a tile spacing option, which I would just keep it 0, but if you need it, what this does, it adds a little bit of padding between each tile and the texture that it exports. And you can choose how many pixels between each, or how many pixels get padded on each side of each tile in the tile set. Okay. And you also have the option of converting all the textures into power of 2 textures, which basically means that that the dimensions of each image would be a power of 2. So it would be like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512. You know, the dimensions, the width and height would have those values. Okay. And this might be needed if you're importing into another option and some of your textures look blurry. It might be because your textures aren't a power of 2, and so when you import them into other programs, the program is kind of resampling those textures into power of 2 textures, and when it does that, it has to like resize it, and when it resizes it, then you know the pixels get like blurred and resampled and that sort of thing. So to prevent that, you could just use the power of 2 textures. Okay, and that would just add extra space onto the tile set. Okay. The next option is the scale option, and this just basically kind of adjusts the scale of everything. It uses this value here that you specify, and it multiplies that to all the vertex positions. So if you have a vertex position at 1, it has an x position of 1, and you multiply it by 2, the x position would become 2. And it basically just would multiply everything by 2 and cause it to be magnified 2 times basically. Okay, so you could adjust the scale that way. You could also specify a fraction if you want to cause it to become smaller, like 0.5 would make it half the size. But anyways, that's to adjust the scale if you need to. Otherwise, I'd just keep it to 1. And then if you have to scale it, you could also scale it in the program that you import it into, or just scale it here if you need to. So those are all your options. And when you have the settings that you're happy with, you could just click export and then choose where you want to save it. And I'll just save it here. I'll just save over this other one. Okay, and it'll say exported file right there. Okay, so now it's exported. You could also export the objects And what this does is, for example, I have two objects in the scene here, and it will export only the objects and not the actual scene. So it's kind of similar to right-clicking in an object in the scene tab and exporting the object. You could do it that way just to export one object, or you could go over to export objects and export all of them all at the same time, so that you don't have to go and right-click each one in your scene tab. Okay, so you can just select all your objects, choose the exporting options that you want for those objects, choose export, and then you'll have to choose a folder that you want to save them in to. So I could create a new folder and called objects, then select the folder, and it'll export all the objects into that folder. Okay, so now that we have a scene exported and objects, let's look at different programs that we could import these objects into and see how that all works. Alright, so I've opened up a scene using Windows 3D Viewer. In this case, I exported a scene using flat vertex normals. And as you can see with flat vertex normals, all the polygons stand out and have hard edges to them. Okay, now let's open a different one where I have smoothed the vertex normals using a threshold angle of 180, and this basically smooths out everything. So all the angles, all the edges of the polygons, their vertex normals get averaged with neighboring polygons, so you have like this shading that goes between all the polygons. Okay, now we could adjust the angle threshold to become more selective. In this case, with this scene, I exported it using an angle threshold of 89, and this keeps hard edges between the 90-degree angles. Okay, so you can see that on the house here and the dock right here. The square angles are more sharp and hard, whereas the angles on the actual terrain and polygons that have slightly less angle to them are more smoothed out. Their vertex normals are averaged together. Okay, so by controlling the angle threshold, you could get hard edges and softer edges in your 3D model. Okay, so I have Blender open and we want to import a scene. So we go to File, Import, and choose wavefront.obj, because the files that we export from Crocotile 3D are OBJ files. So we'll choose the OBJ file and import it, and now it's imported. And because it has an MTL file in the same folder, it will import the textures and materials. Okay, so if we go to where is it? Oh, we select the object, and then we go over to the material properties, and we'll see the material has been imported and the texture. You can see that here listed as well as the base color. And we could also check to see if it has a texture by rendering the image. So let me resize this image to fit on screen. And you can notice how the texture is a little bit blurry, which causes some seams to appear, and also notice how transparency isn't working as well. So let's fix those things. To fix those things, you have to adjust one of the values in, where is it? The texture, the base color. It has this little arrow here, and we could expand some of the options. And notice how it says linear. This is the interpolation of the texture. we could choose closest, which says no interpolation, sample closest texel. Okay, so we choose that, and let's see how that changes the render image. Okay, so now let me resize this. You could see how the pixels of the texture are more crisp, and also some of the seams, actually all the seams, have disappeared. Okay, there's just a little variance here because of the way the lighting is shining on it. Okay, so but the transparency still isn't working. It's just displaying black where the transparent areas are. So let's fix that. So now if we go down further into the properties, we could look for the alpha value here. It's using the texture, the alpha values in the texture to determine which areas are transparent. If we expand this, we'll see here that it also says linear, and we need to change that to closest. Okay, now that still won't fix it. If we render the image, notice how there's still black areas. But what we have to do next is go down to the blend mode right here. It says opaque. Choose alpha clip, and then what this will do is clip out all the alpha area. So if we render it, there's now transparent spots, but it's like it's making too much of it transparent. So we need to adjust this clipping threshold and pull it down a bit. Let's try that and see how that looks. So if we render it now, it looks better. Okay, so that's how you get the transparency to work. Okay, so that's basically how you can import into Blender. There's probably other settings that you could use if you want to change the way that it looks, like if you want different lighting and shadows and that sort of thing. There's probably other stuff that you could do, but that's more of a Blender tutorial and not really related to Crocotile 3D. Okay, so let's look at another example. Okay, so here I have Unity open, and all I gotta do is drag the object file that I want to import into Unity into the assets folder. As you can see, the raft object was imported, and now I could right click and create a material and then change the shader type to a legacy shader, go to transparent, and then diffuse. This gives me a texture that I could choose. So I'm going to import the texture by dragging it into the asset folder, and then I'm going to drag the texture over here into the material shader. Then I'm going to drag the material onto the object, and now the object has the texture applied. As you can see, it's a little blurry, so if we go into the texture, we could adjust the filter mode from bilinear to point, and that'll make it more pixelated and crisp. Okay, you can apply those changes, and there you have it. Now that you have an object imported into Unity. Now if your texture is still blurry, it might be because your image file doesn't have the power of 2 dimensions to the width and height values, which are like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, that sort of thing. So you'd have to change the size of your tile set or export it with the power of 2 dimensions when you export it from Crocotile 3D. So if your textures are still blurry, try doing that. Okay, so here we have the Godot engine open, and I'll just drag an object over into the scene, the file system, and then I'll drag it into the scene, move it into position. And then I'll go over to the materials. The materials is empty, so we'll need to add a texture. I'll drag a texture over. So now the texture is imported. Now I will click this and choose new spatial material. Then I'll click this and it'll open properties for the material. Then I'll go into the albedo channel and select a texture for it. Go to load, then I'll pick the texture that I just imported. And now the model has a texture applied to it. But as you can see, it looks a bit blurry. So let's fix that. You have to go back over into the import tab over here, click the texture, and it'll give you a bunch of properties and things to set. If we go down the list, it'll show a filter, a flag. Let's turn that off and re-import it. Now the pixels are crisp, okay? But you could also notice that the transparency isn't working, so let's go over to the texture properties in the inspector tab. Flags, yeah, it's under the flags channel. Transparent, put that on, and now the pixels have transparency, okay? So there you have it. Now you have an object imported into the Godot engine. Okay, so another place that you could upload your work is to Sketchfab. And this is basically a website where people can kind of show off what they've created and share it online. Here's an example of something that I've uploaded. And as you can see, if you zoom in, everything looks good. So I'll walk you through the process of uploading something to Sketchfab. All you got to do is hit the upload button and then drag and drop your files. We have an OBJ file, a PNG file, and an MTL file. We hit continue and it's going to prepare the files by uploading them and then processing it. And processing will take a bit of time, so you just have to wait. Okay, so it's finished processing, and you can click this button to see how it looks. You can zoom in, but you can notice how some of the texture looks blurry and it's not quite right. So let's edit the 3D settings by clicking that button, and it'll open this little editor with more specifications that you could change. Let's zoom in a little better so that we can see stuff. As you can see, the texture is a little blurry, so let's fix that. If we go over to the materials section and look at the base color, we click this arrow, it'll drop down some options, and we have to change the filtering option from trilinear to nearest. And as you can see, now the pixels are crisp. So next, we have to go to opacity and click this arrow, drop down these options, and change the filtering for the opacity to nearest, and that'll fix that other issue with the transparency. So now we have the scene looking good with the crisp pixels and the transparency looking all right. So when we're happy with that and any of these other settings that you want to change, just hit save settings, and then you could exit out of that. You can finish up the description and anything else, add a tag, put Crocotile 3D or whatever, and then publish it. So that's basically it. So there you have it. Those are some ways to import and export stuff that you've created in Crocotile 3D into other applications. Basically any application that supports the OBJ file format will be capable of importing anything that you create. So yeah, that's Unity, Godot, Blender, Unreal Engine, basically anything since OBJ files are widely supported. So that's all for now, and stay tuned until next time.